Vanishing Point. The Time Bubble, Book 6, written by Jason Ayres, narrated by Mark Rice-Oxley. Prologue. June 2025. Kaylee was crippled with fear in a way she had never been before. It was the kind of fear that people only felt at the very real prospect of imminent death, and it was consuming her whole body like a slug of poison coursing through her veins. She was a lithe, fit woman in her mid-20s, but right now she felt as weak and helpless as a frail old woman. Frantically, she tried to suppress her body's overwhelming reflex to be physically sick and to summon up the energy she needed to keep running from her assailant. As she descended the stairs on the fire escape that led down to the ground below, the desire to throw up was too strong, and she paused briefly, leaning over the metal banister to projectile vomit over the side. The staircase behind the superstore ran all the way from the top floor of the car park above to the entrance to the shop below. As the splatter of her semi-digested breakfast hit the floor some 30 feet below, she heard a woman's voice further down the stairwell exclaiming, "Disgusting!" That was all very well for her to say, thought Kaylee, but she hadn't just seen her husband murdered in cold blood right in front of her. Barely a minute ago, up on the roof, she had seen her beloved Charlie hit by a futuristic laser weapon that had made him briefly glow an incredibly bright blue before completely vanishing. The unidentified black-clad and masked assassin had then turned the weapon on Kaylee, but the young woman had been nimble enough to just about scramble out of the way, leaving her abandoned Sainsbury's trolley to be zapped into oblivion instead. Despite being utterly traumatized at seeing the love of her life vaporized right in front of her, her survival instincts had kicked in and she ducked behind a large white transit van that was pulling out of a parking space close to the sliding glass doors that led to the entrance. From there, she had managed to dive through the doors despite a third thunderous laser blast shot taking out the van and presumably the unfortunate occupant within it. Desperate to escape, she headed towards the lift doors, but she soon realized there was no escape that way. A crude handwritten note attached to the lift doors informed her it was out of order again, leaving her with the choice of the travelator or the stairs, a decision which needed to be made in a split second. She opted for the latter, figuring they were less open, making her a more difficult target for the assassin who she assumed would be coming after her. She could also see that there were people blocking the travelator with their trolleys. She would be a sitting duck. As she burst through the doors and began to descend the stairwell, there was only one word in her mind, and that was, why? Was this some random terror attack with some new type of weapon she had never seen or heard of before? Or was it a premeditated hit, and if so, why was whoever it was targeting her and Charlie? They were just a normal young couple doing their Saturday morning shopping. They didn't have any enemies. It had been the most ordinary of days until they had emerged onto the top floor of the car park. Charlie had been pushing the trolley, and they had been chatting amiably about their plans for the weekend. Their friends, Josh, Lauren, and Hannah, were coming around for dinner, and they had just bought everything they needed, not just the food, but also copious amounts of alcohol. That dinner was never going to happen now, she thought, as she willed herself on, leaping down the stairs 3 steps at a time. She was desperate for what she hoped would be the relative safety of the store. At least there were security guards there. Admittedly, they were probably more used to dealing with shoplifters slipping bottles of vodka into their coat pockets than assassins with laser guns, but it was better than nothing. These and countless other thoughts whirled through her head in the relatively short time it took to descend the stairs. This couldn't just be some random terror attack. There had been other people around at the top of the car park, but the assassin had ignored them, focusing solely on her and Charlie. There was no doubt it was the two of them the assassin had been after, and Kaylee knew that escaping through the doors had only given her a temporary respite. She felt a growing feeling of despair welling up inside her at the realization that her chances of getting out of this alive were slim. Part of her almost didn't want to escape. Charlie was her whole life. Without him, was it even worth surviving? Should she just give in and accept her fate like a condemned prisoner at the gallows? But then she would never know the reason behind all of this, and she doubted that the assassin was going to give her the courtesy of an explanation before blowing her away into oblivion. There was a tiny flicker of hope inside her that perhaps Charlie wasn't dead. Perhaps the laser beam hadn't been a weapon, but instead had just transported him somewhere else. It was the stuff of science fiction, but after all the adventures with the time bubble a few years previously, her mind was open to all kinds of possibilities. The only other comforting thought she had, and it was an extremely tenuous one, was that if the assassin did kill her, maybe she and Charlie would be together again somewhere. It was an odd thing to think of, because she had never believed in any sort of deity, but the likelihood of impending doom had suddenly made the existence of some sort of afterlife an extremely appealing proposition. By now, she was halfway down the stairwell at the entrance to the middle level of the car park. As she swung around the corner toward the next flight of stairs, she almost knocked a mother with two young girls out of the way in her haste. The woman gave her an extremely filthy look, which suggested she was the one who had seen the contents of Kaylee's stomach descending at high speeds towards the ground floor moments before. There was no time to apologize or issue a warning. What use would that be? If the assassin was only after Kaylee, these people would be safe, and if not, no one would be against the sort of weaponry the killer was toting. Kaylee risked a quick glance back up the stairs, but there was no sign that she was being followed. Briefly, she allowed herself a little hope that maybe she was going to get out of this alive after all. Her hopes were swiftly quashed as she arrived at the bottom of the stairs and the assassin reappeared right out of thin air directly in front of her. With a sinking feeling, she knew now that the game was up. It was the first time Kaylee had got a proper look at her executioner, not that it gave her any clue as to the identity. The assassin was so heavily clad in black body armor and a mask that covered the whole face bar the eyes that she couldn't even tell if it was male or female. Come to that, she couldn't even be sure it was human. The armor was made of some strange-looking metallic material that made her wonder if it might not be some sort of robot or android. Could it be an alien or something from the future? "Why are you doing this?" cried Kaylee, as the killer raised the weapon that had already killed her husband. They would be her final words, as no reply was forthcoming. There was a high-pitched whistling sound, and then a single, brilliant, bright blue laser bolt consumed her body, instantly annihilating her. Barely anything was left behind, just the single yellow flower that she had been wearing in her hair, which was blown off her head by the blast. Other than that, there was nothing, not even a hint of smoke. Beneath the mask, the assassin smiled, pulled a wand-like device out of a side pocket and pressed a button before stepping forward and vanishing. Other than the small yellow flower fluttering slowly downwards towards the regurgitated bits of muesli and skimmed milk congealing on the floor, it was as if neither of them had ever been there. Chapter 1. September 2055. It was springtime in Canberra, and Josh and Alice Gardner were visiting one of the most advanced scientific institutes in the world. Australia had risen to become a major world power after the Northern Hemisphere had been crippled by the devastating Black Winter of 2029-30. Nowhere was this more apparent than at the gleaming futuristic buildings of the Australian National University, the pioneering hub of revolutionary new technologies that were set to change the world. For some time, Josh had been enjoying holographic conversations with Dr. Henry Jones, the centre's most eminent scientist. He and his wife Vanessa had been at the forefront of developing the increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence in the robots that were now becoming ubiquitous in homes and workplaces across the world. It had made them famous and also extremely rich, wealth that they had used to bankroll ever more advanced research. By the mid-2050s, Henry and Vanessa had delved far deeper into the complexities of the human brain than anyone had been able to before. Their aim was to achieve something previously thought impossible: the ability to transfer human consciousness completely into a digital format that could be stored forever or transferred into a new host. It was this research that Josh was particularly interested in, and he and Henry had discussed it at length. In return, Henry had been just as enthusiastic about Josh's field of expertise. It was well known in academic circles that Josh was the world's leading authority on time travel theory. He had written many papers on the subject during his long career at Oxford University, without ever quite revealing the full extent of his knowledge. What few people other than Josh's closest friends and confidants knew was that he wasn't just an expert in time travel theory. He had already achieved the ability to travel in time and done so many times. Those in his inner circle had long ago decided that it was too dangerous to allow this knowledge to be revealed to the wider world and had kept it to themselves for decades. Josh had let some hints slip to Henry that it might be possible, purely to keep him interested enough for him to grant Josh access to the Institute. He was fascinated by the work they were doing there and the possible applications it might have if combined with his time travel technology. To investigate further, he had arranged to meet Henry and Vanessa to see their work firsthand. Alice had reluctantly agreed to the meeting, even though they were supposed to be on holiday. She knew how obsessed her husband got over these things, and if she didn't indulge him, it would be all he would talk about for their entire trip. It would be no big deal to give up a day or two out of the several months they were spending travelling the world. The weather was warm and pleasant as they walked through the gardens in front of the impressive frontage of the Scientific Institute. It was an unusual semicircular design that was reminiscent to Josh of the old BBC television centre back home. But that was where the similarity ended. This was no 1950s concrete block, but all gleaming glass and metal that exuded wealth, confidence and technology. The cherry trees lining the path leading up to the entrance were in full blossom. Birds were singing in the trees, and the sun was beating down on Josh's face. It was every bit like a sunny April day back home, but here, of course, the seasons were reversed. "This place looks mighty impressive," remarked Alice, echoing what Josh was thinking. "I should think so, with the amount of money they've spent on it," replied Josh. "From what Henry tells me, there's no shortage of cash from the government for research, and that's on top of Henry and Vanessa's personal wealth. They get more in funding in a year than we get in a decade at Oxford, and we're hardly poor. It seems like Canberra is deadly serious about becoming the technological capital of the world." "The city has certainly changed a lot since my backpacking days," remarked Alice. "I spent a whole summer travelling around Australia the year before I met you." As they approached the entrance, the double glass doors moved swiftly and silently aside, leading into a large circular foyer. It had a spotless white marble floor, a ceiling supported by several thick white pillars, and the surrounding curved walls were covered in screens showing corporate videos of the Institute's work. A grand, wide staircase led up to a balcony at the back of the room, presumably leading deeper into the Institute. What was notably absent was any sort of desk or human receptionist. Instead, one of the most lifelike androids Josh and Alice had ever seen walked smoothly towards them. Indeed, neither of them even realized it was a robot at first. It was only when it spoke that they realized it wasn't a bona fide flesh-and-blood woman. Alice was never quite comfortable affording gender to a robot. Somehow continuing to refer to them as it helped to remind her that these were machines, not people. Many disagreed, and a substantial robot rights movement was springing up around the world, led primarily by humans who were more concerned about the exploitation and rights of these androids than the androids were themselves. In the case of this female android, with the stunning figure, perfect complexion and immaculate white one-piece business suit, it was impossible not to see her as a woman. "Hello, my name is Danny," said their host. Danny paused briefly, looking first Josh and then Alice intensely in the eyes. "Retina patterns confirmed. Welcome, Josh and Alice Gardner. You are meeting with Henry Jones." Up close, both visitors now recognized Danny's true nature. She was a little too perfect, with none of the minor imperfections that every human has. The retina scan and the slightly robotic nature of her voice were also a giveaway. The subtle nuances of human conversation and use of slang terms still hadn't been fully cracked by artificial intelligence. Despite Danny giving herself away, she was still a major advance on any robot they'd seen before. How much longer would it be until they would be indistinguishable from humans, and what would be the implications of that? "I must say you are very lifelike, Danny," said Alice. "Isn't she, Josh?" "I'll say," replied Josh, trying not to make it too obvious that, as well as being impressed by the android, he couldn't help noticing how attractive she was. This wasn't unusual for female androids, particularly in the Far East, where a roaring trade in sex robots had sprung up, leading to an outcry not just from the moral objectors, but also from human sex workers who were finding clients increasingly hard to come by. "Thank you," said Danny. "My creator has designed me to mimic human activity in every possible way." "Isn't she a beauty?" said a voice with a strong Australian accent from the top of the staircase. "I designed her myself." "Henry!" exclaimed Josh, recognizing the flamboyant character now bounding down the stairs towards him. Despite having chatted face-to-face online with Henry many times, seeing him in the flesh for the first time was still quite a shock. With his ample girth, Henry looked to have reached a pinnacle of non-fitness, yet here he was racing down the stairs with the energy of an Olympic athlete. His mop of wild curly red hair sat atop a similarly ruddy complexion. He didn't have the slightest fleck of grey, which was impressive for a man in his late 50s. By far the most stunning thing about him was his shirt, which would be considered loud even in Hawaii. It featured a bright sky-blue background covered in pineapples. "Are you going to a party?" asked Alice, as this large, hairy, pineapple-clad figure bore down on them. "Only if you're inviting me, my dear," replied Henry, exuding charm as he reached for Alice's hand and subsequently kissed it. "It's a real pleasure to meet you." Next he turned to Josh and vigorously pumped his hand. "And it's an absolute delight to meet you at last, my dear fellow," added Henry. Despite Henry's old-fashioned mannerisms, Alice couldn't help but like him. He radiated warmth and friendliness. "The feeling is more than mutual," replied Josh, before turning to Alice and adding, "Don't be overwhelmed by his attire. This is quite normal for him." "Larger than life, that's me," remarked Henry. "I must say you are doing a grand job of cultivating your eccentric professor look," said Josh. "When did you last have a haircut?" "Oh, sometime around the end of the last decade, I think," replied Henry, with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "It's growing rather well, don't you think? I'd like to claim it's because of my strong genes and clean living lifestyle, but I have to confess it's all down to cellular regeneration. A little sideline of mine, you won't see a bald head or a grey hair around this place." During this exchange, Danny had stood almost motionless and almost unnoticed, having been shunted out of the limelight by Henry's impressive entrance. Now she spoke up. "Can I offer you some coffee?" "Let's all have some coffee," announced Henry enthusiastically. "You do drink coffee, don't you, Alice? Proper coffee, that is. None of this decaffeinated nonsense." "Of course," said Alice. "Where would we scientists be without it? Something's got to keep us going during all those late nights burning the midnight oil." "Splendid," replied Henry. "Well, Danny here makes a fine pot of coffee, among her many other talents. Let's go upstairs and you can meet Vanessa. I've told her all about you." He led them up the staircase, which was made out of the same pristine marble material as the rest of the floor. Alice watched her footing carefully, as it looked slippery. "Not the safest staircase in the world," she commented. "Oh, you think so? Well, watch carefully," said Henry. "You're gonna love this." He turned to Danny and said, "Danny, change decor to rustic." The android's eyes briefly glowed bright blue, and Josh and Alice watched in awe as the scene around them was instantly transformed. The marble in the lobby was replaced by traditional oak, as was the staircase below them, which now looked distinctly safer underfoot. In addition, the screens had vanished from the lobby below, now replaced by a series of famous paintings, from Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers to the Mona Lisa. It was as if the whole room had been magically whisked back a century or more in time. "That is absolutely amazing," remarked Josh. "How do you do it?" "We call it nanoscene," remarked Henry. "It's something we developed right here at the Institute. Everything in this room is made of a malleable material made entirely of microscopic nanobots, which link into the network that controls this entire facility." "Fascinating," said Josh, who was truly impressed. "How does it work exactly?" "It's as simple as this," said Henry. "Just now, when I asked Danny to change the decor, they simply remoulded themselves into the style I requested like a big ball of plasticine, hence the name nanoscene. Think of it a bit like changing the desktop on your computer. The floors you saw when you came in aren't made from marble at all. The nanoscene itself is actually a spongy material, rather like the stuff they use in kids' playgrounds to protect them if they fall. The applications are endless." "I've seen some amazing technological developments in my lifetime," remarked Alice, "but this is the most incredible yet." "It doesn't stop there," said Henry. "By the time you've finished here today, you'll feel like you've seen the 7 wonders of the future world." They had reached the top of the stairs now and turned right along a long, curving white corridor, with windows to the right offering spectacular views of the Molonglo River. "This is us," remarked Henry, as he turned to the left towards a plain white door which slid smoothly open, revealing an incredibly futuristic-looking lab. "This is where the magic really happens," added Henry. "I'll say," said Alice. "It looks like something out of Star Trek." She wasn't exaggerating. Her first impression was of the sick bay she had seen in a recent Hollywood blockbuster about interstellar travel, but this was on a much larger scale. The large white circular room was huge, at least 30 yards across, with banks of computer panels and touchscreens filling every wall. Alice's eye was particularly caught by a couple of beds at one end of the room, hence why she had thought of the sick bay in the film. She noticed that there seemed to be a motionless body lying on one of them. Were they treating patients in here? And if so, for what? Then she remembered Danny and realized that it might not be a human body she was seeing. Perhaps this was where they developed the androids. The interior of the laboratory was filled with several work areas woven in the same circular design. It was curves, no rough edges. Sitting at one of these was a striking woman with short, blonde, curly hair who Alice guessed was approximately in her late 40s. She was wearing a traditional scientist's white coat and intently peering into a holographic display of the human brain in front of her. When she heard them approach, she snapped off the display and got up to greet them. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Vanessa," said Henry. "As you can see, she dresses a little more formally for work than I do." "Like chalk and cheese we are," said Vanessa, smiling and offering her hand to Josh before kissing Alice on both cheeks in the style Alice had become used to when travelling across continental Europe. It seemed that Mr. and Mrs. Jones were very touchy-feely. "This whole place is out of this world," remarked Josh. "Pretty much everything I've seen since we walked through the front door has blown my mind." "Now you can see why so few people are allowed to come here, especially from outside Australia," said Vanessa, eyeing Josh appreciatively, which didn't go unnoticed by Alice. "However, you two are a special case." "We consider ourselves privileged," replied Josh. "But why exactly?" "I'll come on to that," remarked Vanessa. "But let's begin by explaining exactly what we've been doing here." "I can't wait," replied Josh excitedly. It looked like it was going to be an interesting day. Chapter 2. September 2055. "Where's Danny with that coffee?" asked Henry. "Why didn't you go and look for her, my sweet?" replied Vanessa. "You seem to enjoy spending time playing with her." Vanessa's words were seemingly said in jest, but Alice was sensing some definite undertones. Her first impression had been that they seemed an extremely oddly matched couple, he loud and flamboyant, she prim and businesslike. "There's no need for that, she's here," replied Henry as Danny walked in. She almost seemed to glide, so perfect were her movements, with no sound at all from her footsteps. She was effortlessly balancing a heavy tray of cups, a coffee pot, and various accompaniments. "Oh, that's lovely, Danny. Did he bring any biscuits?" asked Henry. "I've brought your favourites, Henry. Jam sandwich creams." "What would I do without you, Danny?" asked Henry. "Put your tongue away, Henry, though I imagine she's already had plenty of that," remarked Vanessa in an extremely acid tone. Alice had been right, though Vanessa's latest remarks went far beyond undertones, said as they had been with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. This certainly wasn't a marriage made in heaven. "Vanessa!" exclaimed Henry, rebuking her before turning to Josh and Alice. "I must apologise. My wife has a tendency to be a trifle brusque." "Just my little joke, dear," replied Vanessa. "But don't think I don't know what you built her for." "I can't believe you've got jam sandwich creams," replied Josh, doing his best to diffuse the situation. "I thought they were just a British thing." "I discovered them back in my formative years when I spent a couple of years at Cambridge," replied Henry. "I've had a craving for them ever since, so when I found some in an online store over here that specialises in British food, I snapped up a couple of dozen packets. I got some Marmite too while I was at it." "Don't I know it?" said Vanessa. "I think it's vile stuff. He left some on the knife I used to butter my toast the other morning, and it nearly made me heave." "Well, they do say people love it or hate it," said Josh. "How very apt," said Vanessa, with a pointed glance at Henry as she was saying it. "Enough of these pleasantries," said Henry, attempting to make light of his wife's barbed comments. "Let's get on and show you what you came here to see. I expect you're wondering why there is a body on the couch over there." "It had crossed my mind," replied Josh. "Well, without further ado," said Henry, and with a grand flourish, accentuated by his pineapple-clad attire, gestured that they should follow him to the other side of the room. As they approached the body on the couch, Alice could see that, as she had first suspected, it wasn't a human body at all. It was that of an android, which was clearly supposed to be a facsimile of Henry. It wasn't the body shape that gave it away so much as its attire, clad in what could only be one of his shirts. This one contained a selection of palm trees of a lurid red and orange background depicting the Hawaiian sunset. The android's skin tone wasn't as realistic as Danny's, but it wasn't properly finished off, being only a very basic default face, such as you might find as the factory setting on an off-the-shelf robot. "Good, isn't he? I designed him in my own image," replied Henry. "I still have to graft on the face, but we've been concentrating more on the neural side of things rather than the cosmetics." "Other than the face, you can hardly tell the difference," said Alice. "Except if you look closely you can see he's not as fat as the original," interjected Vanessa. "Well, I had to find a use for my old shirts," said Henry, ignoring her jibe. "This one's an XL and I can't get into it anymore. It's the middle-aged spread, you know. I blame the steaks at Madison's. They are simply out of this world. But don't take my word for it. Come and join us for dinner this evening." "Will you be going for the 16-ounce this time, dear, or do you fancy tackling the 24-ounce again?" asked Vanessa. "I'm up for tackling the 24-ounce if you are," replied Josh. "I love steak. We don't have it often back home because of the methane tax." "Quite right too," said Alice. "I'm practically vegan these days." "I don't see any harm in having red meat as an occasional treat," said Henry. "Occasional treat?" questioned Vanessa. "You're an absolute carnivore, my dear. You should see him at Christmas. He has a whole turkey to himself." Each time Vanessa used the word dear, the amount of sarcastic loathing with which it was uttered seemed to increase. Alice tactfully attempted to steer the conversation back towards the matter at hand. "What are you planning to do with this replica?" she asked. "It's pretty straightforward, really. Vanessa and I, despite our little bits of banter, which I'm sure you've noticed, make a good team when we're working together." "I did sort of pick up on something," said Alice. "It's just our way of getting through the day," said Henry. "Anyway, we recently made an incredible breakthrough that we've kept top secret. No one knows anything about it until now. That's why we invited you here to show you." "You should feel very privileged," added Vanessa. "We do," said Josh. "I'm intrigued, though. Why have you singled out us for special treatment?" "Because I believe you may be able to greatly assist us with the next phase of what we are aiming to achieve here," said Henry. "How exactly?" asked Josh, suspecting that it must have something to do with time travel. "Let's leave that part until we're on the steaks and red wine tonight," said Henry. "For the time being, why don't I enlighten you further by way of a little demonstration of what we've done so far? Vanessa, will you do the honours?" Henry moved to the second empty couch and laid down. "This android body is at present an empty shell," remarked Vanessa. "It has a state-of-the-art artificial brain capable of learning and independent thought and a hard drive ready to be written to a capacity of 1 exabyte. Wait, did you say an exabyte, as in 1,000,000 terabytes? Asked Alice. "Contained in this one android? That's unbelievable." "Is it?" asked Vanessa. "It isn't really, when you think how fast data capacity and transfer speeds increase over time. Take the 8G mobile network, for example. It's millions of times faster than the old 4G networks we had when we were growing up. This android body alone possesses more memory capacity than the whole of Australia had at the start of the century." "What we're going to do now is show you how to put that capacity to good use," added Henry, who was looking extremely laid back as he lounged in his Hawaiian shirt on the other couch. All he needed was a tequila sunrise to make him look like he was lying by the pool on holiday, rather than taking his place in a groundbreaking scientific experiment. "As Henry told you before you came here, we've dedicated a large chunk of the last few years to mapping the human brain with a view to eventually uploading it into digital capacity," said Vanessa. "Which I believe you've already demonstrated to some extent," said Josh, recalling Henry's recent contribution to a documentary holographic podcast on the subject. "Oh, a few conjuring tricks with mice for the masses, yes," replied Henry dismissively. "But the truth is, we've gone a lot further than anything we've shown the public. As I demonstrated in the documentary, we have been able to make a rudimentary copy of a mouse's memory for some time, something that could be archived to a hard drive, rather like the storing of old documents. But that was merely a snapshot of memories put into a basic robotic mouse designed to run around a maze. It wasn't something that could communicate with a consciousness. Since then, we got so much further than that," said Vanessa. "The first step was to create something that could properly communicate using a neural network. Even so, to begin with, this had its limitations," said Henry. "Our early prototypes could talk about past experiences and recall family events, but not with true consciousness," added Vanessa. "For example, one of my copies could remember details of a holiday I'd been on when I lived in England those couple of years," said Henry. "It could recall paddling in the sea or the time a seagull stole my chips on the seafront at St Ives, but it couldn't associate the feelings that came with those experiences. It couldn't relate how bloody cold the water was or how pissed off I was at that bloody seagull, merely that the events had actually happened." "And now?" asked Alice. "We've made unbelievable progress," said Vanessa. "What you're going to see today will blow your mind." "Are you saying you've achieved true consciousness?" asked Josh excitedly. "That could change the world." "That's exactly what we're saying," said Vanessa. "I find that somewhat hard to believe," replied Alice. "All the research I've ever read on the subject has concluded that creating a truly accurate, conscious and sentient copy of a human mind is impossible." "I've lost count of the number of things that science has said are impossible over the years," said Vanessa, "until they became possible." "She has a point," said Josh, thinking about how he had learned to time travel, contrary to popular scientific belief. "How does it all work?" "It's quite simple, really," remarked Henry from the couch. "You see this dish here?" He gestured upwards to a large white curved spherical disc on the ceiling several feet above him. "Yes," replied Josh. "Well, this is going to scan my brain completely and upload it into Henry Jr. here. The whole process is going to take less than a minute." "As simple as that?" asked Josh. "I've seen this sort of thing done in old films, and they always had some big helmet or something they had to wear with loads of wires and stuff sticking out of the side." "Oh, yes, I've seen those old black and white movies too," replied Henry. "But they were made a century ago, long before the makers could have had any concept of wireless technology. The modern equivalent is far more straightforward and completely painless too." "It doesn't harm you at all?" asked Alice. "No, we've tried it a couple of times already. I'm not losing any brain cells in the process. It's a pure copy we are creating, with the original left intact." "What happened to your earlier copies?" asked Josh. "They're right here," said Vanessa, gesturing at the body on the couch. "We've used this same body each time. There were a few teething problems with our previous attempts, which meant we had to wipe the earlier versions." "What sort of teething problems?" asked Alice, feeling a little wary. "Oh, nothing to worry about. replied Vanessa, sensing Alice's apprehension. "We are reasonably confident we've ironed most of the issues out now." "When do we start?" asked Josh, fascinated to see the outcome of the experiment. "Right now," replied Vanessa, pressing a large green square on the touchscreen panel on the headboard of Henry's couch. "And now we stand well back," she said, gesturing the others that they should follow her back to the other side of the room. "We don't want the scanner picking up any stray thoughts from us and putting them into his head." "It's a bit like being at the dentist when they have to leave the room when they take the x-rays," observed Josh. "Good analogy," replied Vanessa. From a safe distance, they watched as the equipment emitted a barely audible hum. "I thought it would be a bit more dramatic than this, all flashing lights and sparks," remarked Josh. "That'll be down to watching too many of those old movies you were talking about," replied Vanessa. After less than a minute, there was a repeated beeping noise and the low hum of the machine stopped. "This sounds like an old microwave," said Alice. "Another good analogy," replied Vanessa. "Our new Henry's effectively cooked and ready to go. Let's go and meet him." The original Henry was already sitting up, none the worse for his experience. "All present and correct, I think," said Henry. "The thing about this process is you don't feel a thing. Now, let's see how my copy has turned out. Computer, activate Henry Mark IV. The android Henry's eyes glowed blue and he instantly sat up and looked around him. "Obviously, other than the shirt, he doesn't look exactly like me, at least not yet. Like I said, we haven't worried too much about the aesthetics, but we do possess the ability to graft a person's exact features on if we so wish. I could make him indistinguishable from myself, couldn't I, Henry?" "Indeed you could," said Henry IV in the same slightly robotic-sounding voice that they had already heard from Danny. "He doesn't sound like you either," replied Alice. "Yes, but he could," replied Henry. "We can, in theory, replicate any human being in every detail, including their voice, mannerisms, and that one thing that makes humans stand out from robots, our imperfections." "But would it still be an android?" asked Alice, "not a living, breathing creature?" "It wouldn't be breathing," replied Vanessa. "But as for living, that really depends on your definition. If it can feel emotion, then surely it must be alive, mustn't it? Why didn't you ask it?" "I'm not an it," protested Henry IV. "I'm a he." "How do you feel?" said Alice. "I feel great," replied Henry IV. "I had a bit of a toothache earlier, and that's gone for a start." "Yes, I really must make that dentist's appointment," said the original Henry. "You can remember the toothache and what that felt like then?" asked Josh, addressing Henry IV, "even though presumably you have no teeth yourself." "Don't I?" asked Henry IV. "No, I suppose I haven't, and it seems I have no tongue either." "But you still remember everything?" asked Alice. "You retain the essence of everything that makes Henry the individual he is?" "I certainly do," replied Henry IV, gesturing across to the original Henry. "As far as I am concerned, up until a few minutes ago, I was living in his body." "And that doesn't bother you?" asked Alice. "Why should it?" replied Henry IV. "If you think about it, I've just immortalized myself. Now that I'm in this new body, I've just eliminated all disease, pain, and fear of death. What's not to like about that?" "And emotion? Has that been replicated too? For example, do you still feel love towards Vanessa here?" The original Henry snorted with laughter at Alice's question and said, "Maybe that isn't the best question to ask him." "Perhaps not," said Alice, realizing that if the original Henry didn't have much affection for his wife anymore, the robot's algorithms were hardly going to be pulsing with romantic overtures for her either. Then she thought about what the android had said earlier about having no tongue, which brought to mind a far more intriguing question. "Tell me, Henry Mark IV," she said, "how much are you enjoying looking forward to that big steak tonight at Madison's?" Henry IV's LCD blue eyes seemed to glow more brightly for a moment, and he sat up enthusiastically on the couch and said, "Can't wait. Their onion rings are the best in Australia." "But you're an android now," said Alice. "You can't eat, surely? You've got no tongue, but the original Henry can." "Oh," replied Henry IV. "I hadn't thought of that." Although it was only a shell without the original Henry's face or voice, it was still possible to sense the disappointment in the android's speech. "How does that make you feel?" asked Josh. "Pretty lousy," said Henry IV. "I'll never eat steak again, will I?" You'll never eat anything again, said Josh. It's really depressing, said Henry IV, and he slumped back down onto the couch. You can't feel hunger, though, can you? Asked Alice. You don't have a stomach. Why would you still even want a steak? Because I can remember the pleasure of what it tastes like, said Henry IV. Yes, he would feel like that, said the original Henry. And I should know. This is one of the big problems we haven't overcome yet. In a way, we've almost done too good a job of replicating the human psyche. He's got all the emotions and feelings I've always had, but without the capacity to enjoy life to the full, at least not in that body. There is much work still to do. I want their steak, said Henry IV grumpily, sitting up again. OK, I think we'd better deactivate you now, said Vanessa. I don't want to be deactivated, said Henry IV. You only created me 5 minutes ago, and now you want to kill me? Yeah, you'd enjoy that, wouldn't you? Look, just forget about the steak, it's no big deal, I won't even mention it again. Computer, deactivate Henry Mark IV, said Vanessa. The android's eyes went out, and it flopped back onto the couch before it could protest any further. Looks like you've got more than a few teething problems there, remarked Alice.